have Dave McMacken with us, and he is going to be giving our evening program. Everybody give Dave a warm hand.
Thank you. Thank you, Holly. When the Evening in the Park series began in 1979, it was the work of Alma College and the city of Alma, and it centered on Conservation Park and the Eyre Learning Circle there. Some of you probably remember back to those days, a long time back. And then it drifted over to the riverbank, and then into Wright Park and other places in Alma, then into St. Louis, a number of venues here. And then Breckenridge, Ithaca, Reeds Park. It's kind of spread out over the years. I have the privilege of presenting my 36th talk of Evening in the Park tonight. I think I'm the only one that's been there every year. So, well, the title of the talk is about Gratiot's health spas. Gratiot County had 2 health spas, which makes it kind of unusual in Michigan's counties. That hasn't happened, I don't think, in very many other places. And so that's what tonight's story is about. Back in the 19th century, the late 1800s, there were a lot of diseases that had really no treatment that was effective or no cure. Some of the names, dyspepsia, and diphtheria, and maybe catarrh, and there were a whole bunch of them. Doctors really didn't know very much that was effective medicine in the late 1800s and before, and so they did the best they could with what they had. What they had, some knowledge of antiseptics. They did have a couple effective anesthetics, but the drugs that they used often weren't really very effective, but they were kind of standard treatment. So, if you don't know what's going on, give them this, and we'll see what happens. So, in those days, and to some extent, my doctors told me today, medicine was an art, not a science. There was just simply a lot of guesswork involved in it. So, that meant that there were a variety of treatments that were used. Anything that might help was important. One of the treatments was mineral water from mineral springs. And it was popular in Europe. People went off to Baden-Baden in Germany, and in the United States, the rich went off to Saratoga Springs, New York, which was a big spa. And, things like Hot Springs, Arkansas later, and West Baden in Indiana, and French Lick in Indiana, 2 neighboring towns that have just undergone quite a restoration. When we were in French Lick, we went to the Pluto Spring. Gallons and gallons of Pluto water were shipped out of there. Probably hundreds of thousands of bottles. An amazing amount of Pluto water, because Pluto water had the label, "If nothing else will do it, Pluto will." And friends, one whiff of that well loosened my bowels. So, good old Pluto water, a standby of many years. Well, Michigan, we are told, and this was a surprise to me as I researched, has in its waters, that's no surprise to St. Louis people, more minerals than the Dead Sea. So all the St. Louis people here are nodding their heads. They're well acquainted with that. So it's not a surprise that when mineral wells were found in Michigan, they became very important, and people would take baths, they would drink the water, which was supposed to be good for just about every disease. It would cure, they claimed, everything except cancer and insanity. So it was quite effective. Here in this area, we sit over a pool of brine, and I guess it goes by other names according to the chemical companies, and that's what's being pumped, and a whole lot of stuff's being made from it. So Michigan is a mineral spring spot. Now, when I talk about the 2 mineral springs here in Gratiot County, the first thing I've got to do is tell you where they were. Otherwise, you'll keep wondering all the time, well, where in the world were they? Well, we'll use present-day locations. The mineral well in St. Louis, it was located and still is located behind the swimming pool. next to the old IGA, right on the riverbank. And we'll have more of that story in a little bit. The one in Alma was located on North State Street, right next to what is the Amie Wright Mansion. Some of you remember it as Smith Memorial Hospital, slated to undergo restoration. And it was there in a big, enormous building that filled that whole grassy area in the present parking lot of the Wilcox building. And the well was in the basement. A mineral well was drilled, and it was in the basement of that building. So, here in St. Louis, this well was found 20 years before that one was drilled, and it was quite by chance. Now, some of you have heard this story before, so bear with me. It's still a pretty interesting story. Henry Holcomb, a rich man from Connecticut, had come to St. Louis, and I never knew why, but he made a fortune in canal and railroad building in the South, and then came here from Connecticut, and he owned the sawmill, the grist mill, which of course ground flour, and then built the Opera House, and he had a lot of money besides stuff that he had here. And he and some investors decided that they would do what was customarily being done down in Saginaw, where all the sawmills were. They would drill for salt. They would go down into the pool of brine that is under the Saginaw Valley, and if they could find that and pump it, then they would use their multitude of sawdust and slab wood to stoke the fires in the evaporating pans, evaporate the water, scrape out the salt, pack it in barrels, and ship it. Salt was a very, very important commodity back then, as it is now, and especially for the preservation of meat, pickles, things like that. So money was to be had if you had access to salt. And not only that, they got rid of their sawdust and all their refuse wood that way. So they hired a driller from Saginaw, and he came and put up a derrick right next to the sawmill, which is located down about where the electric plant is down near the present dam. And they took power from, I think, a steam engine in the sawmill, and some kind of a, I don't know what the power was, whether it was just a rope or whatever, I'm not sure. The drill was a raise it, drop it, raise it, drop it, raise it, drop it, chisel kind of thing that was going down, 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 day by day. Every once in a while they'd hit a pocket of water, and water would come up in the casing, and they would taste it. Not brine, sorry, try again. Down, down, down. Oh, more water, taste it. Not salt water. So one day they realized that water was coming up. And so they pulled the drill out of the casing, and a fountain of water shot 30 feet in the air full of water and gravel and sand, and it came raining down and went into the Pine River, and everybody rushed there because it was they were all excited. And they tasted it. Nope, not brine. Now what do we do? So the Holcomb and his fellow investors, the stockholders, had to have some kind of confab to see what they would do next. Meanwhile, some young guys are down there in the crowd, and they're putting their hands in the flow of water. That in itself is a little risky because it's really flowing very powerfully, and it's cold. You know, it's earth temperature, probably in the mid-50s degrees. And one young guy from Detroit, a salesman, his name was George Helmer, and he had his crippled hand in the water for, I think they thought, probably about 3 or 4 minutes. And then he pulled it out, and he said, I could never do this before. He could move his fingers. Friends, the magnetic mineral springs of St. Louis, Michigan were discovered right then. Then a paralytic, a guy here in town who could not get around, he began drinking the water and bathing in the water, and before long he was mobile. Well, they regard that as a miracle, and gave it the credit to the water. And before long, people were drinking it, and they're saying, I'm feeling better and more invigorated, and their aches and pains were taken care of, and their kidneys worked, and, you know, just, it was having a good effect on people. Well, they didn't even publicize it, but people outside of St. Louis heard about it, and they started coming in. Pretty soon, it was hordes of people coming in. They came in by stagecoach from St. John's or Saginaw. And the stagecoach ride was horrible. They did not have roads. They had trails. They were muddy. There were ruts. It was a terrible, you didn't go by stagecoach to St. Louis unless you were absolutely desperate. Well, health makes people desperate, and so they were willing to take the ride and be jostled against their neighbors and be thrown this way and that to come to St. Louis and maybe get healed. That was their hope. And so they came by the hundreds and eventually by the thousands. Well, Holcomb and his fellow investors may not have struck brine, but they realized pretty soon they had struck gold. So they put up a crude bathhouse with some person-sized tin tubs in it to give baths, and they began giving the baths. And what had been free to everybody, now they charged for. They piped the water from the well into the bathhouse and charged so much for a bath, probably, I don't know, 15 cents, 20, maybe a quarter. But they were making money, and so more and more people came. St. Louis had a few hotels. In no time they were full. Then they sent out word, if you have a spare bedroom, will you please open it? So some people actually turned their homes into boarding houses, and the people continued to come. And so it was exciting for St. Louis, but there was a big problem, and they began building houses and hotels. At one point, we're told there were 50 buildings under construction in St. Louis because of the need, and carpenters, they couldn't find enough carpenters. And later, a few years later, when bricks were available, they couldn't find enough masons. They tore down the old bathhouse and put up a new bathhouse, 175 feet long, right on the riverbank, with a balcony out over the river. And they had enough tubs so they could give 500 baths a day. So that meant hiring a whole lot of people to take care of this, probably people to give massages and people to heat, all the water had to be heated. If you're like me, you don't want to take a bath in 54-degree water, okay. So everything was heated. The first season they kept it open in the winter. They had to heat the whole building. After that, it depended if they had enough clientele or not. There was a need for better roads, so a company was formed up to build a plank road. This was authorized by the state of Michigan. You put down logs down the road, and then you put planks across, spiked them down. How many planks do you think it took to go from St. Louis to Saginaw? They put a sawmill halfway between. They had plenty of forest, so they just needed to cut the wood. And so they did and started making the plank road. That too had investors. It was not even done, probably not even halfway done. Somebody said, well, okay, the plank road's going to make it better, but why don't we have a railroad? And everybody said, yeah, we need a railroad. So some of the wealthier people in St. Louis, and there of course weren't very many, and a lot of the lumbermen from Saginaw and Bay City said, oh, we agree with that. And so they worked and got a railroad company started and invested in it, all their money. And eventually they started running rails from Saginaw toward St. Louis. So the plank road wasn't done yet when the rails were begun, but it took a while, and so the plank road was supposed to pay for itself through tolls. Well, now they had just lost all kinds of travel on it, so it became a local kind of road, and by law you had to keep it in repair. Well, anything made of wood that's out in the open like that, as soon as you get it down, it's already starting to, in a sense, decay or come apart. You know that. And so it was a big struggle, but the plank road did survive for a while. The plank road is now called M46. It was even in that first year that the first famous person came to St. Louis. It was the detective Allen Pinkerton. He had been guarding Lincoln during part of the Civil War, but at the end of the war, he was working in the South, doing clandestine operations. I always like to say something like that. It's just way too cool. And he felt that if he had been in Washington, Lincoln probably would not have been assassinated. He would have had him protected. He was bothered by that for years. But this well was discovered only 4 years after the Civil War ended. And Pinkerton, in just a couple years, had had a stroke. And one side was partially paralyzed. As soon as he was able to get mobile, he took his daughters and got on the train and came to this primitive town, St. Louis, Michigan. He was desperate. He thought the mineral water would probably help him in his, whatever, I guess, rehabilitation. And so they came, and he could hobble around a little bit with a cane, but he drank the water, he took baths in the water. My opinion is that the thing that enabled him by the end of the summer to walk 12 miles at a time with a walking stick was simply his self-imposed regimen of physical therapy. He was determined. And he did give credit to the water. Now, you wouldn't really know for sure if it was or wasn't. But anyway, he went back to Chicago a happier man, although he could never sign his name clearly and he could never speak clearly for the rest of his life. Well, at the end of that summer, who else showed up but Fighting Joe Hooker, General Hooker of Civil War fame? He'd had a stroke. He had a paralyzed arm. Maybe the water would help him. He was only here for 2 weeks, but he had a good time. He didn't say that his paralysis had declined, but he enjoyed the time here, and after he got back to wherever he was going, maybe back home, he said, he wrote back and said, "I'll be back next summer. I'll take more treatments," or whatever. Well, within a few months, who announced that he was coming to the Springs of St. Louis but one of the most famous men in America? Salmon Portland Chase, Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. He hadn't had a stroke. He probably had the beginnings of Alzheimer's. He desperately wanted to be president. He'd been Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, a thorn in Lincoln's side. Lincoln had appointed him to the Supreme Court to get him put in a place where he couldn't do a lot of damage. And now his mind was starting to fade, and he wanted to be president so bad if he could stop the fading of his powers. And so he was willing to try anything, and Allan Pinkerton, his friend, wrote him and said, "You should go to St. Louis to the magical mineral springs there." And so he finally decided he would try it. So he went from Washington to New York City, where he picked up his nephew, who was kind of his travel agent, I guess, and they came by train to Saginaw. Well, the railroad and Plank Road weren't done yet, so they gave him the best carriage that the company had, and he came to St. Louis through the woods, and it was a pretty wild trip. And here's this famous jurist bouncing around in this carriage, you know, going desperately to try and save his mind. And he didn't know, of course, it wouldn't do him any good. But he came, and he was very outspoken. He didn't like St. Louis. It was too primitive. And he did take the baths. And he first stopped and had rooms at the Eastman Hotel, a gigantic hotel located where the present Methodist Church is located. Then he moved into Elias Smith's boarding house, which was more private. But he made it well known that he thought this place was just way too primitive, and he did not enjoy his residence here for the 2 weeks he was here. He said it hadn't helped him. He knew that, and so he headed back to Washington, D.C., where within 2 years he had died. Well, here they began to realize that some of the people that had begun to come to the springs came not because they were sick, but because they wanted to get away, R&R, and they didn't have to cook. You get the picture. And but they still felt that they did need a doctor because there were so many people. So I don't know how many people maybe applied for the job. I don't know. But they hired a man named Stiles Kennedy, who had been a Confederate surgeon. This is like 6 or 7 years after the Civil War. He's coming into Michigan, and he was a Democrat in a Republican territory. But he came and became the director of the bathhouse. And then he stayed, and then when he left that position, started his own practice, built his house on Washington, and I think it is gone to the city, am I right? And is maybe for sale? Okay, it's for sale. It's right next to Monty Reichert's insurance office. It's that first house of those, I think, 4 on that side of Washington. It's very distinctive. It's a very old house. It's a very historic house. It was the Kennedy home for years, a number of generations. So if you're interested in living in a historic house and you don't, there's your chance. About this time, as you know, things were moving along, another person showed up on the scene here in St. Louis. He was very well-to-do. He was well-known. He had worked here. He had lumbered here. He had been part of the investors on the railroad, and his name was Ammi Willard Wright. Now, we aren't clear why he wanted to leave Saginaw, where he'd been headquartered for years, and come to St. Louis. I think I know why. His wife's health had gone into a decline, and if they could move here and live here, she could have daily treatments at the mineral springs. That's never been written down. It's my supposition. Well, Henry Holcomb was here, and he was well-to-do, and he was sort of the town father. Another man was here. His name was Colonel John Elwell. After the railroad had reached here, literally here, and a big party had been held, they even fired a cannon right here. They went downtown, had a big feast there, and it was quite the day when the first official cars came with all the Saginaw dignitaries. That's as far as this railroad went, right down to just down there. But then another company hooked onto it and extended it over to Alma, and then to the towns, what became towns later, Elwell, Riverdale, Vestaburg, Cedar Lake, and on eventually to Lakeview. This railroad, unlike the one here, this new railroad was poorly funded, and it went broke. Now, there were some people, several, probably at least 3 that we know of, that put $100,000 each back then into it on the promise that it was going to be a huge moneymaker. People, that's millions of dollars today. So they were losing a pile of money. And some of them did come. General Dan Sickles had put his $100,000 of his father's money into it. He came. And then Ben Richardson, who was not famous, but he had a lot of money, he came and then he took over and he put Ben Richardson on all the cars on the railroad. They were his. But the guy that really was important was Colonel John Elwell from New Jersey, who had some money, and he was secretary of the railroad, and he came on site to see if he could rescue any of his investment. Eventually, he brought his family here from New Jersey, and they lived in what's now the Lux Funeral Home at the corner of Pine and Center. And right next to it was the Henry Holcomb Mansion, probably the biggest house in town at that time. Later, it was divided into 3 parts, which were apartments, and then 2 of them were moved. One's on north of Center on Pine, and one is south of Washington on Pine, and they have a steep roof. You can identify them by a very, very steep roof. The middle part, I think, of the Holcomb Mansion was dismantled. But Holcomb lived here, Elwell lived here. They were important. And Ammi Wright knew very quickly he was not welcome in St. Louis. He could have bought and sold both of them probably several times, and they didn't want him around. So, what did he do? He took his wife to Saratoga Springs, New York, and bought a mansion there and moved his family there while he commuted to Saginaw to run his multitude of businesses. And he said, well, I'm going to invest in Alma. Well, Alma was about as calm, quiet, unassuming, unexpectant rural town as you could find. And when Wright showed up, and he had already had a store there, a branch of his big Saginaw department store, when Wright showed up, he began pouring money into the town. He built the Opera House block. Hang on, friends, you could see action there anytime. And the Wright Hotel, regarded as the finest hotel outside of Detroit. And then he brought the Central Michigan Normal School, which was the forerunner of Alma College. And in the mid-1880s, he started building a big building on State Street, where I described it, between what's now the Wright Mansion and the Wilcox Building, neither of which were there then. And they drilled a well 200 feet in the basement, and guess what they hit? Mineral water. Well, that's no big deal. In Alma, you could drill down 10 or 20 feet and you could get a flow. There were 100 flowing wells in Alma at the time. If you wanted one in your backyard, you could have it. So the 200-foot well, though, had mineral water. It wasn't just plain old water, it was mineral water. So that's what they were after. This 3.5-story building went up, a huge, very imposing Victorian building. While that was happening, and just before it, the springs here had been bought by Dr. Willis Andrews of Indiana, and he came and ran them, and he said, what this town lacks, and believe me, the patrons of the town, all the people, visitors, said, yeah, is a first-class hotel. He said, I'm going to build it. So we built what became the Park Hotel, right in front of the bathhouse, right up to Mill Street. And this was regarded as a first-class hotel. It was the Park Hotel because it was by a grove of trees, and on the other side of the grove of trees was the flour mill. Okay, people weren't as demanding back then. And the flour mill had 2 mill streams that came out between the well and the Park Hotel and the bathhouse. So you had to go over little bridges to get to the water, but that was being piped into the basement of the Park Hotel where the bath rooms were located now. He tore down the old big long bathhouse and put in a smaller building, a sanitarium, in the same spot on the edge of the river for the very ill people who would come. And so kids were admonished, don't make noise down by that building. The people in there are very sick, and you should not bother them. So that was the setting of the Park Hotel in St. Louis. Now, we know that they gave baths in the basement, and you get a massage, and the doctors there, Dr. Andrews and his doctor sons, would tell you what you needed to do and what exercise, all that stuff. But we know more detail about the Alma Springs Sanitarium, and this is really, really cool. What did they have in the way of baths? Talk about medieval tortures. 2 Turkish baths, 1 Russian bath, a vapor bath, 2 shampoo baths. And I don't know what ailment you would have there short of lice, but I don't know. They had a needle bath, the only one in the state, and it cost $400 to install. They had a plunge bath. That was a swimming pool in the basement, 18 feet long, 12 feet wide, 9 feet deep. A therapy still used today, a very good one. Those areas of the baths were carpeted in velvet. This place was posh. And they had an electrothermal bath, but what it did, they hooked up, they wired you, and then I think they had maybe a little hand crank dynamo or something, and they electrified you. Now, I have a feeling that if you cranked it enough, you could raise just about anybody short of a corpse. But probably they had it under control, hoping for repeat visitors and not to shock them too much. But the electrothermal bath did give them some current. They had a medicated vapor bath, so you could breathe in your medicine in the steam that was in the room. What did they treat? Well, rheumatism and neuralgia, aches and pains, catarrh, which is a sinus infection, dyspepsia, indigestion, nervous prostration, probably overwork, I don't know, female complaint, the eyes, the ears, the throat, the lungs. They manufactured their own oxygen there, and anybody with lung trouble breathed in through a mask the oxygen, the liver, the stomach, and the rectum, which I assume was a treatment for hemorrhoids. The halls were carpeted. There was an elevator that went from the first floor up to the 4th floor attic. There was a gymnasium. It had all the stuff in it that you would find today in a gym in like a motel or something like that, exercise room. It had all that. It had a rowing machine, dumbbells, weights, the whole works. And then they advertised that their beds had springs. In an age when most people had mattresses filled with straw or corn shucks, maybe if you had wealth, you might have feathers. Springs were regarded as a luxury at that particular time. Mr. Wright imported an landscape architect from Chicago and had him design a 10-acre park behind the sanitarium. It had a circle drive in it. It had walks through all the trees. It had tennis courts. You could play croquet, so you could walk. It had goldfish pond. And then nearby was a livery where you could rent a horse and carriage if you wanted to just drive around the town or the countryside. You were taking the air, meaning getting some fresh air, and that was regarded as very, very important. Well, when you arrived in either St. Louis or Alma, here at the depot, not this depot, but the one down there, or at the one in Alma, you would be greeted by people from the institution. They would have there an omnibus, a long bus that would seat probably 10 or a dozen people. A beautiful team of horses always, and you entered through a door at the rear, and the seats were like in some limos where they were long along the side and posh. I mean, they would have been very plush seats. And then you would head toward the sanitarium or the park hotel, and your luggage would follow, the horse-drawn wagon. Then you would arrive at your destination. You'd go in, and when you got in the lobby, you would sign in. And then you would be assigned the room, and you would be reunited with your luggage, and an appointment would be set up for a consultation with a doctor. Now, the consultation with the doctor was not a physical exam, really. And whatever it was probably, you were probably totally clothed. This was Victorian times, and people were a little touchy about that kind of thing. And so he would find out what your ailment was as far as he knew, and then tell you how many glasses of water you had to drink day after day, and how many baths you would take, maybe what kind, what other stuff you would do, maybe there was some medicine involved. And then it was up to you to make sure that you followed his directions and followed that regimen if you expected for your health to improve. Some famous visitors came to the Alma one. These were, of course, much later than the ones that had come here. One was Philip Studebaker of the great Studebaker Buggy Works in South Bend. He was a very, very sick man. Now, you're expecting me to tell you that the treatments there helped him. Nope, he died. Okay. Then another well-known person came. His name was Henry H. Dow from Midland. And the doctors were very honest with him. They told him and his family, "You are dying, and we will send you home to die." And he went home and did. But he was well acquainted with Alma and St. Louis because, and we have the correspondence, he had corresponded with Ammi Wright's son-in-law, Henry Lancashire, who was basically at that time in charge of the sanitarium in Alma. And because it was mineral water, that was the kind of thing Dow knew would make a whole lot of products, and he could make money. So the correspondence between Dow and Lancashire, Midland and Alma, centered on raising money so that Dow could come and start a company in Alma. And the last letter says, and from Henry Lancashire to Dow, "We are sorry, but we cannot raise the $25,000 that you are asking for to start a chemical company in Alma." The Wright fortune, when Mr. Wright died, and that would have been just a few years later, totaled $5 million in 1912 dollars. Hundreds of millions by today's standards. And they couldn't raise $25,000. it was very plain Lancashire didn't want a chemical company in Alma. Dow also asked St. Louis about it. St. Louis had already had a chemical company down on the river. It had gone broke. They'd had another one. It went broke. They didn't give any incentives. Maybe they couldn't raise the money either. And so as a result, well, they had to wait until the 1930s to get Michigan Chemical Company, which has been both a blessing and a curse. So there it was. Now you know why Alma and St. Louis do not have the Dow Chemical Company, and Midland does. By 1900, new medical discoveries had made the mineral water less important. You couldn't prove it was helping, maybe it did, but X-ray had been discovered by then, and new drugs and new treatments. And so the mineral water baths and that kind of thing were mainly just for pleasure if you wanted to take a nice bath and have a massage. And the clientele dropped off both in Alma and St. Louis. And the Andrews family here struggled. And Dr. Andrews, I'm absolutely convinced, did have what we call Alzheimer's. He lingered for probably 8 years with his mind steadily going. And after he died, the family eventually sold the Park Hotel, and it was run during the 20s and 30s by a variety of people. And then in the 1940s, Walt Hess bought it. Hess had, I think it was probably the world's largest duck hatchery out on the north side of town, where the Nürnberger Middle School is located. And every once in a while, a duck got injured out there, a young duck, a duckling, and so they were brought down to the hotel, and they were used in the dining room. And then people said, oh, this is really good. And all of a sudden, the Park Hotel became noted for its duckling dinners. People planned their Sunday afternoon drives to make sure they ended up at the Park Hotel. The duckling dinners were as famous as Zender's chicken dinners are today. It was just absolutely well known in the state of Michigan. But the freeway, of course, bypassed the town, and motels sprang up, and the old hotels were doomed. Eventually in the 60s, maybe in the 50s, the last bath was given. Eventually the dining room was closed. Eventually all the rooms were closed. The hotel was shut down, and in 1968 was demolished. So what happened after that? Well, it was about in the late 50s, I think, that the swimming pool was built. And the well located behind there at some point was capped and covered with dirt. And people basically didn't know where it was. They just lost track of it. Well, in the late 80s, early 90s, I got a call from a guy named Robert Andrews from Rochester, Michigan, and Arizona. And he said, I own the rights to the mineral well. And he said, I'm dealing with the city on this. And they kind of humored him and said, okay. He says, I want to reopen it, and I want to market the water. Now, he out in Arizona realized that bottled water was becoming quite the thing in the 80s and 90s, and this was a ready market. He would bottle it and ship it out there by the trainload if necessary. That was his dream, and I helped him with the history of it and everything, and then I think Jerry Paulson helped him locate the well. And they found the pipe, and they uncapped it, and they pulled out the old pump that was in it, and they pumped the well out until they got clean water, and they had it analyzed. And it was the very same water that had been discovered in 1869. The analysis was virtually identical. Well, he was thrilled, Robert Andrews was, because now he could say, this is the water. And he was so thrilled that he came with a gallon of water to our house and gave it to us. And we drank it, and you know what happened? You won't believe it, but I am actually 115 years old. See, I was afraid you wouldn't believe it. And I'll tell you what it tasted like. It tasted like really good water, because it didn't have much taste. And it was coming out of the well, and okay, that's fine. And so then he brought over This, the second bottle, it was pumped into Robert Lalonde's milk trucks and taken down to Saginaw to the Shea Water Company, where it was bottled in these vodka bottles and marketed through the Saginaw Valley. And he brought me this and said, this is the second bottle. Friends, this is the water right here in this bottle, the magic water. It's just fantastically wonderful. That we haven't drunk it, you can see. He put labels on it, gave the history of the well and all that, and promoted it. And then he came up for a visit. He was not a well man by any means. That's not a pun. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry about that. He was a sick man, and one night he died here in his motel room. Well, the family had a squabble. The well had been willed to his son Christopher out in Arizona. When I rewrote the history of the Park Hotel and the well, I tried to contact him, got no response from him. He obviously wasn't real interested in this. And then when the city began dealing with him a few years ago, then he called me and wondered what was going on. I said, well, I don't know what's going on. This is not my business. You work with the city. And so the arrangement, anyway, ended up that the city came into possession of the well. Now it's there in its little gray shack near the electric plant behind the swimming pool. The little shack where the pump was to pump it into the milk trucks is gone. But the well is still there, the original well. Over in Alma, as the patronage dropped off, Amy Wright wouldn't keep the building open in the winter because he couldn't afford to heat this huge building. And eventually he just closed it. Now he had this white elephant on his hands. What's he going to do with it? No one wanted to buy it. What would you use it for? Well, the misfortune for the Masonic Lodge turned out to be great fortune for Alma. Their old folks' home at Reed's Lake down by Grand Rapids burned. It was a magnificent stone building. Now they needed a place for their retired older Masons to come, and Wright thought maybe he could sell it to the lodge. Well, they took their time on this, and it was probably smart because Alma was far away from the main population centers of the state of Michigan, and people might not want to come that far away from friends and perhaps relatives. So after about a year, Wright said to his associate Lester Sharp, who took care of business for him, give it to them. And he made the offer, and that was too good an offer to refuse. And so in 1911 it became the Michigan Masonic Home, and that's how it came to Alma. They used it until the late 20s, and they regarded it then as a fire trap. And they wanted new facilities, so they built the brick facility out on the north side of Alma. And once all of the residents had moved there, they sold the old sanitarium building to a salvage firm in Lansing who tore it down brick by brick, board by board, beam by beam. They saved it all, and it got reused. They didn't just wreck it like we do today and cart it off in a dump truck. So parts of that building are here and there. Some in Alma, some of the flooring went into a little house that was being built right across State Street from the sanitarium. So what's left? Well, there's the well downtown, and at the back of the Wilcox Nonprofit Center, right next to Wright Park, is a pipe that comes out of the ground. It's the last well drilled for use there. I think it went down, 2,000 feet or something, and brought up warm water. Now the place became the Alma Hot Springs Sanitarium. The only problem was it all went into a tank where it cooled, and then they had to heat it if it was going to be used. So anyway, now the question I haven't dealt with is, why was it the magnetic springs here? Early on they discovered that if you took a knife and you held it in the flow of water, or even if you put it in a glass full of the water, it would magnetize the knife. This was not the only magnetic well in Michigan. There was one at Alpena. But most of the wells that have been discovered, mineral wells, did not have this particular feature. I have magnetized a knife in just water I took from my outside tap that had not gone through the ubiquitous softener that we all have to have. And it magnetized so that you could pick up little tacks and pins and needles. Nobody knows why. Nobody knows what special characteristics this water has or where it got them that it magnetized stuff. Now, some of you are probably, you're going to go home and try and magnetize a knife, and it's not going to work, and then I'm going to look like a fool. But it worked for me. And I took it to a Lions Club, as I was talking about the water, and I took a quart of St. Louis water, which elicited an enormous amount of laughter because it was brown. Okay. Well, this is a story of 2 mineral wells in one county. That's kind of unusual. And there's still a sign of both of them left today. And they, if nothing else, left an interesting chapter in Gratiot's history. Thank you very much.